So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about a book I've mentioned in previous book reviews. The first one I did for a live video here on Facebook was a review of N.K. Jemisin's what was it? 1,000. I can't remember it now, so I guess it wasn't all that impressive. um, the 100,000 Kingdoms, which I couldn't end up recommending. At that point, I was particularly struck by the insistence on postmodern power games in that book by N.K. Jemisin, and I was equally struck by a similar kind of power game going on in Circe, which I'm going to be talking about today. And at that point, I hadn't finished Circe, and I wasn't sure that I would even get to the end because it wasn't going very well, which I'll talk about in a bit. But basically, it ended much better than I expected. It was a very beautifully written story by an author I hadn't heard about before. I came across her on my Twitter feed, although I'm not a Twitter person. I hardly ever use it, but for some reason I happened to be on Twitter, and I noticed that one of my favorite authors, Catherine Valenti, had recommended the book as something that stood out to her, and it was something that she hadn't expected would stand out to her, specifically because it was basically nothing more than a straight up take on Greek myths. It wasn't even really, she said, an updated version of them, which, revisions and kind of legends and myths rethought are very popular nowadays. But this wasn't even that. This was just basically the Greek myths retold through the perspective of Circe, who was one of the characters in the Odyssey and shows up in a lot of different epic poems and in the myths at large. She's a daughter of a Titan, Oceanus. There's a story about her in Prometheus, before Prometheus was punished by the gods, and how she is the only one who shows him any kind of kindness. She's kind of a loner. Among the gods, she's considered to be rather ugly, uninteresting, and what I found to be kind of fascinating is one of the things that the other gods don't like about her is that she has a human voice. So the gods are known for having these booming, impressive, scary voices, and she doesn't. She has a screechy, quiet human voice, which I thought was an interesting detail. And because of that, she's able to communicate with humans in a way that doesn't scare them, the humans, which has its pluses and its minuses. And she really begins to express herself and start to find herself when she falls in love with a human named Glaukos, who's a fisherman, and happens to accidentally just he happens on her island, and he thinks initially that she's a human, again because she's kind of unremarkable in appearance, at least for a goddess, and her voice is not all that impressive, also in godliness or whatever. So she falls in love with him, and being a young girl, decides that she wants to make him into a divine being, so that once he reaches divinity, she will then be allowed to marry him. And in this process of accidentally making him into a god, after she was told she can't do it, or that she shouldn't even try it, because if she did, then she would be performing magic, which is looked down upon by the gods, because the gods don't dabble in magic. They have their own powers, or they don't have them, and to seek powers that are not your own is considered to be beneath you, or even somehow an abomination of some kind. The gods do not need magic. So she does it anyway because she's besotted and she wants Glaukos to be hers forever. And she thinks that what she does to him is just a natural product of this herb that she finds, which it's a flower that grew from the blood of one of the Titans. I can't remember which one, possibly Kronos. She takes this flower and she crushes it and pours it into Glaukos' mouth, and Glaukos turns into a merman, a divine, sort of a lesser divinity with blue skin and flippers and a tail and things like this. She thinks he's gorgeous. He thinks he's gorgeous too, and proceeds to forget about Circe's existence, except as I don't know, a sister, as he says. And then he falls in love, or he chooses, of all the nymphs that surround Circe's father's court, a nymph by the name of Scylla. And those of you who know Greek myths know what happens next. Circe gets mad, wants to remove Scylla from the scene, and uses the same herb that she used on Glaucus, not realizing that, thinking that it would reveal Circe for who she is, meaning that she would turn, sorry, not Circe, but Scylla, meaning she would turn into something ugly and horrible because she's this fatuous nymph who's got no purpose in life. Except she turns into the famous monster, who in Madeline Miller's description is actually quite horrifying. She's kind of a mix between an octopus and a dragon and a sea serpent altogether. It's kind of awful. And so she goes and does her thing, and Circe, as a result, is banished to her island. And then that's when things start happening. And that's when we eventually meet Odysseus, and it follows along pretty close. The story then follows along pretty closely along the Odyssey, and eventually follows the sequel to the Odyssey, which was an epic poem in ancient Greece that was lost. I can't remember what it's called right now, but it concludes with, rather oddly, with Telemachus, Odysseus' son, and this is a bit of a spoiler, except that the story is based on myths, so there's really no surprise here. She, in the original story, ends up marrying Telemachus instead of Odysseus, and she raises him to divine status, just like she had done Glaucus, except it works this time. And they are all blessed by Athena in the end, and everybody lives happily ever after. This is not what happens in Circe the novel, and this is where things start getting a little bit odd. Is where Madeline Miller begins to diverge from the myths. Now, again, this is a beautifully written story. I think she's a fantastic writer, and she's got some very interesting and important things to say about the human condition. Except Madeline Miller seems to be still stuck in the same framework of, as I mentioned, as I called it before, postmodern power games that seem to dominate the cultural conversation now, and in a way that is weird and kind of annoying, if I'm honest about it. Basically, the theme of the book can be perhaps said to come from a conversation that Circe has with her elder sister, Pasiphae, who is an absolutely horrid creature. She's a horrifying person. She is the mother of the Minotaur, or Minotaur as Americans say, as in literally the mother. Yes, you know that in the myths, the gods oftentimes do bad things with animals. Unfortunately, in this novel, these things are a little bit too dwelt on. Nothing explicit, but there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's clear what the gods are doing and why. And the whole point is not to sort of wallow in disgustingness, but to make the point that the gods and their monsters are no different from each other. That in fact, probably the monsters are less monstrous than the gods. Now, this is expressed by Pasiphae, Circe's sister, in very modern language, and it's clear when she begins this conversation with her that we're no longer in the world of ancient Greece. That Madeline Miller is using these characters, as any good novelist does, to express something important about the world that we live in. And she insists that Circe has it all wrong, that Circe is constantly trying to attract the attention of her father and of the other men around her, and that everything she ever does is a plaintive call to the angels of the better nature. And she makes the point that the gods have no angels of their better nature. They have no nature other than to dominate, other than to destroy everything around them, other than to make ugly, other than to pervert. And she says, Circe, you're missing out because you have amazing magical powers that you have recently discovered and that you're becoming more and more strong in. She is, after all, a witch. And you are using this power, again, to get the powerful meaning your father and the other men, to pay attention to you, while what you should be doing is what I am doing, says Pasiphae, and that is to manipulate everybody around me for my own pleasure, and so that I can be in a position of absolute power over everyone else. Circe finds this conversation baffling and extremely disturbing. It flips everything she knows about the world on its head. She refuses to accept it initially as being true, except the first thing that happens to her as soon as she is exiled onto her island is she welcomes a company of sailors who have been shipwrecked and who are tired and who have been out probably marauding. She welcomes them to her home. She feeds them. She makes them welcome. She gives them hospitality. And she notices that they don't think that she is a god because of her voice. And what ends up happening, that despite the fact that she has been giving them all these good things, the first thing that they do when they find out there is no man on the premises is that the captain goes and, yes, rapes her. She, although she's divine, for some reason is unable to do anything about it. And the point here is clear. It's to make, well, it's a reflection of kind of the cultural moment we're going through, the sort of Me Too moment that's happening. That's reflected in the recent Gillette ad, where the automatic assumption about what men want and what men will get if they have the slightest provocation or the slightest opportunity is they will take, and they will take forcefully. Now, she, of course, Madeline Miller uses this opportunity to vicariously give the power back to the woman by having Circe then accept every single sailor who is coming by, and whether or not they even make the attempt to take advantage of her, she turns them into pigs regardless. And this is exactly what happens when Odysseus comes. She turns his men into pigs before they have a chance to do anything. And Odysseus has divine protection, so she's unable to do that to him. And he presents her with an odd man. He presents himself to her as an odd creature, a creature who is an equal to her and who is not interested in taking advantage of her constantly, but a fallen man, a man with a lot of psychological and emotional problems that she then sees reflected in herself. And so she's able to provide him with hospitality in a different way than she was before. She gives him her love, or she gives him her love. She falls in love with him. He falls in love with her, and they're able to emotionally support each other in ways that she has not been able to before at all throughout her very, very long history as an immortal being. And this romance between her and Odysseus is the best part of the book. It's as if all of the postmodern thinking, all of the Me Too stuff kind of fades away, and we're left with two human beings who are not human beings. One of them is a human being, the other one's a goddess, but really she's not a goddess other than her immortality. She acts and thinks like any normal human being, which is typical of the Greek myths. So these two damaged creatures are able to love because of their faults. They are able to sort of set aside their own selfishness, their own needs, and able to give to the other in a very beautiful way. It's honestly some of the best romance that I've written in a long time. Of course, he has to leave because he is an honorable man and he must return to his wife, whom he loves very dearly, but whose love is a different one than he has for Circe. And ultimately, Circe does something that she's never allowed anyone else to do, and she allows herself to be to conceive and to have a child. The being pregnant and giving birth sections of the book are amazing. They are so realistic. Obviously, Madeline Miller has had a kid herself. Either that or she knows somebody who has, because the way that Circe describes raising a small child who is needy and who is who has a strong character is reminiscent of, I think, pretty much any parent who has gone through this. It's absolutely wonderful. And it doesn't read like the myths. It's as if Madeline Miller kind of walks away from the grand mythical aspect of everything and just hones in on the really human stuff. And there, when she honed in on the human, on the everyday, she becomes an absolutely fantastic writer. It's too bad that she didn't do more of that. But ultimately, this book is not about the small moments of love between damaged people. This book is ultimately about empowerment. And this is where it loses its universal appeal, as far as I'm concerned. Now, there's something to be said about choosing myths as the basis for a fiction story in the 21st century. Whether or not Madeline Miller wanted this to happen, by choosing myths, she's automatically placing her story in a mythical setting. In other words, we know that what we're talking about is overarching. It's not small. We're not talking about the specific needs of an individual, the specific conflicts, the motivations, and the journey of one small person. We're talking about something on a level of humanity. The choosing specifically the Greek myths is interesting because the Greek myths and the tragedies that came after them, after Homer, at least the way the Greeks saw them, they had a very specific purpose. In particular, if you read Aristotle's On Poetics, he talks about the transcendence of tragedy specifically, even more than epic poetry, even though he did like epic poetry, Homer in particular. The transcendence of this art form lies in the fact that it's able to create a very specific emotional response within the reader, something called catharsis. Now, this catharsis was, for Aristotle, a kind of awakening to the transcendent around us. He very much believed that literature is an important step. The appreciating the beauty in literature is part of living the ethical, the moral, the philosophical life. And tragedy, specifically Greek tragedy, does that in a very specific way. It always has to do with a fault that a human being has with reference to a god, and that fault becoming the hindrance that prevents that human being from making good on his fate. And so something terrible happens, and the gods become angry, and this person, this human being, because of his one single this fault, falls, and there's a terrible tragedy, and the person watching or reading the story is sort of absorbed into the suffering of the character in the story, and they come out through that story, through the catharsis of it, changed, and in a way more willing to adopt in their own lives the means necessary to transcend the mistakes of the person in the story. So there was definitely a moral and an ethical component to Greek myth. This is why even after the coming of Christianity, when there was a lot of polemical and apologetic literature specifically attacking the myths and the gods as silly, a point that even many philosophers of that time admitted, because the myths were nothing more than the glorification of human vice, not even human virtue. Still, the Neoplatonists of a certain period, especially the 4th, 5th century, tried to redeem those same silly stories about those same silly gods by giving them more cosmic, symbolic significance, where the gods were actual manifestations of universal cosmic forces, like weather, like love, like all kinds of things. And from that point of view, the myths are actually stories that are fascinating, interesting, and applicable and universally interesting. But more than that, if we pay attention specifically to a lot of interesting new neurobiological research, we know that fiction in particular, and plot-based fiction, not character-based literary fiction, but plot-based genre fiction, has the capacity of allowing the reader to inhabit the world of the novel, the world that the author creates, in a much more immediate and in a much more immediate way than nonfiction. So much so that the parts of the brain that actually that take care of movement, the movement centers of the brain, are actually activated when a person reading fiction is reading about those movements. So in some way, the reader is physically, not physically, but mentally inhabiting the life and the body and the actions of the characters in the plot-driven story. That being the case, then we know that good fiction, and I make this point a lot, good fiction has the capacity of actually changing people's lives for the better, because they make people more empathetic, because they encourage people to act in a better way, which is ultimately why it's so important that we read good fiction, not just anything that comes across in front of us. That's why I'm a big proponent of vetting, for lack of a better word, fiction for its quality. I don't think that you should read just absolutely anything that you find interesting. I think that people should be searching for the kind of fiction that will elevate you, that will make you try to live a better life. It's certainly what the Greeks did. It's certainly what they did when they chose to watch the tragedies and to listen to the epic poetry. And this is why we even had a canon for so long, the Western canon or whatever other canon, is because the works that transcend, the works that tend to take the reader and elevate them to at least try to be a better human being, those are the things that we need to read. And this is where Circe, Madeline Miller's Circe, falls flat, because the end is all about self-actualization. And this was, when I read the end, when I was getting to the end, I was so excited because I thought I knew where she was going. And unfortunately, when I'm reading mythic fiction, I'm always reading with, maybe not unfortunately, but with Tolkien's On Fairy Stories in the back of my mind. Now, Tolkien had a very specific vision of what mythic fiction should do. He talked about the eucatastrophe. He talked about the lack of need for the tragic ending, because after the coming of Christ, he was a Christian. All tragedies have ended because there is ultimately a happy ending to the fate of humanity from the Christian point of view. So, and he makes the point that the mythic storytelling accesses parts of the human experience that are supra-rational. They get to the heart of the matter, and they affect people in a much more immediate way, which is what I've just been talking about. So as I'm reading the story, knowing where the story of Telemachus, after Odysseus' death, Telemachus comes and visits Circe along with Penelope, knowing where the story is supposed to end in the Greek myths, I thought I saw what Madeline Miller was doing. And I'm going to do a little bit of a spoiler here. So it's not going to really ruin the end, I don't think. But if you don't want to know what happens, tune out for a bit. Athena has been the bad guy through most of the book. She's this super proud, she's obnoxious. She's really obnoxious. She's all about getting her way. She's like a child, like a lot of the gods are, actually. But ultimately, we know that Athena, at least in the Greek and Roman pantheon, she's supposed to be the goddess of wisdom and as well as the goddess of war. But although she can be hard, she's also ultimately, in almost all of the myths, a positive figure, because she rewards human attempts to bring order to a chaotic existence. And she does this in the original version of the story, the epic poem that doesn't survive, by raising Telemachus to divine status because of his, because not just to make Circe happy, but because they've gone through a lot of suffering and they've come through it still with their sort of divine spark intact, if I can put it that way. So I thought that after this entire long book of painting the gods or the divine in general as a reflection of the absolute worst in the human, something that N.K. Jemisin does on purpose in the 100,000 Kingdoms, where she explicitly makes the point that since we are created in the image of God, that means that God must have the same failings that we do. So this is exactly what happens here, but I was hoping that she would go the other way. I was hoping that Madeline Miller had read Tolkien and that she was presenting us with the perfect recipe for a eucatastrophe. A eucatastrophe is basically Tolkien's idea of the best possible ending to a fairy tale, where everything is going really bad. The main character is basically put in front of an impossible situation, and at the very last minute, rather than it being a deus ex machina, something happens to change the fate of everybody involved, and then the main character can come out victorious. So it's not Deus Ex Machina, but it is a kind of switch of fate that happens on a kind of behind the scenes way. So I thought that Athena, after being the bad guy the whole movie, would come at the end and recognize Telemachus's divine qualities, because Telemachus is probably one of the most positive characters in the novel. He's a very, very well drawn individual. He's a fantastic character. I thought that at the end, finally, Circe would see a side of the divine that she had not expected, the side that Prometheus showed her, the side that wishes to help humanity achieve their ultimate destiny, which is immortality. Even in the Greek myths, the humans are constantly reaching for immortality. Something that then becomes clear in the sort of the true myth as the true myth as C.S. Lewis would have it of the coming of Christ. She didn't do it. I thought that Athena would come and she would kind of crown their suffering with the ultimate gift of everybody becoming divine, and then they could kind of continue to pursue their journey happily. We don't get that. And Madeline Miller, I don't know if she was trying to be more literary fiction or what, but in the end, she basically there is no end. We're right at the cusp of the ending, and it looks like Circe is about to try to make herself human, in a kind of flip to the epic poem of making Telemachus divine. And she has this sort of flash of insight into what her life might be if she were to be transformed into humanity. And she sees this gradual fading of existence into nothing as something that is ultimately sad but beautiful. And we're left at a kind of vague moment right before she drinks the potion to make herself human. It's supposed to leave you with a kind of wistfulness and a kind of a wondering feeling of what might be. And it stank. I hated that ending. It was terrible. Because through the whole book, we are presented with allegorical imagery of the modern world as being horrific and awful. And then we are presented with Circe as this strong woman who is able to stay true to herself and to stay true to some kind of virtue, in spite of the fact that there is nothing good around her at all. And this excellent way of telling a story, where this is classic storytelling, make the world around you a terrible place and make the main character somebody who has to navigate through it and try to make something of it. The end was begging for Circe to enact in her divine power some sort of change on the world around her to make it better, to leave a lasting change on this world that is so fallen, on this world that is so messed up. And it doesn't happen. And that's why I didn't like it, the ending, ultimately. Still, the book was a wonderful read. I listened to it on audiobook. The narrator is very good. It is explicit in some points. There's some pretty nasty violence. There's some pretty unpleasant sexual stuff going on behind the scenes mostly. And ultimately, it's kind of pessimistic about human nature in general, which I was hoping it wasn't going to be. And ultimately, what that meant is that in the end, the ending that it was begging for just didn't happen, and that was to its detriment, I thought. And it's a reflection, unfortunately, on the world we live in. If you're going to phrase the grand narrative of your novel as a kind of good versus evil tale, but in a universe where ultimately good is what you want it to be, whatever you want it to be, which is the ultimate postmodern vision of the good, then you can't possibly transcend the evil, because the evil is also a valid choice, because all choices are equally valid. This is the real big problem with constructing classical grand narratives while trying to be true to the postmodern vision of life. It ends up ringing hollow in the end. So although you're following all of the rules that Aristotle set out in On Poetics, which still ring true to this day, and which any good writer should follow, by the way, yes, if you're a writer, you should read On Poetics, because it tells you exactly how to write a story that will be eternal. Mostly, there's some things that have dated a little bit, it being a long time ago. But if you're going to follow those rules, you have to see to the end. You have to, at the very least, do it as the pagans did before, in the BC. If it's going to be an ultimately pessimistic view of the world, then have it as a proper tragedy. Give the reader some catharsis, so that at the very least they can feel that they might have some effect on the immediate surroundings of their world. But here, it's like you're trying to give everybody the best of all possible worlds. Circe becoming human is lame. It doesn't make sense. Yeah, she's been divine through her whole existence. Everything about her is defined by her endlessness and by her being the only good divinity among all the divinities. But rather than allow that aspect of her to actually affect some change, that one thing that is her is then taken away in the strangest possible way. Again, we don't know if she becomes human. It's left vague. But it's ultimately a disappointing story. But again, it's worth it because she's a beautiful writer, and it's a fascinating take on the myths. John Simmons in a comment here says, it can't be worse than the musical Rent on primetime TV. That is certainly true. Plus, we are going through a polar vortex, so why not open up an interesting postmodern take on the classical Greek myths. John Simmons also asks whose guitar is in the background. That is my wife's guitar, which I gave to her as a present a few years back. Unfortunately, the last string keeps breaking because of the enthusiasm of certain small creatures who inhabit this area and who are on the exact right eye level of the guitar. And so they like to play it a lot. The little ones do. And as can be expected, they are enthusiastic in everything that they do. Sometimes the enthusiasm becomes a little bit too much. So that's what I want to talk about with Circe. I don't know what we'll talk about, which book I'm going to discuss next. Probably it's going to be Naomi Novik's Spinning Silver. I know I mentioned that already in a previous video. Haven't gotten around to finishing it yet. Right now I'm kind of stuck in the middle of, Ted Beckettsello says, just like their dad. Yes, enthusiasm in everything. This is my motto in life. Anyway, I'm in the middle of editing book 4. So those of you who follow me and who have been waiting for book 4, I ended up finding a very serious plot hole in chapter 3, which is an important chapter because it sets up the entire magic system and the entire story and the entire conflict and the entire everything of book 4. And I made a big mistake that my editor did not catch. I caught it today by accident and it upended everything. So I need to get it right. Otherwise the story won't make any sense. So it's going to be probably another 2 weeks or so while I edit this thing properly. It's a complicated storyline. There's kind of wheels within wheels. It's sort of a Russian nesting doll of a story. And there are literally sort of worlds within worlds. And each world has its own complex cosmology that has its own complex rules, and they all have to work together in a way that makes sense. Plus, there's time travel, because, of course, why not? So those of you who have been waiting for it, I apologize. You're going to need to wait a little bit more, but I hope that it's going to be worth your time. Also, I have been posting these video reviews on YouTube. I have an author channel. It's just in its infancy, but if you'd like to follow me on YouTube, you're more than welcome to. And those of you who like to listen, I'm probably going to be making this into some sort of a podcast in the near future. Sorry, John Simmons, I'm going to make your head hurt, I know. But if you like to listen, and if you're interested in my stories, you should know that my first book, The Song of the Siren, is available as an audiobook on all audiobook retailers, narrated by a wonderful Shakespearean actor, John Payton, who's great. We are just about finished with book 2, and we're waiting for the sound producer to finish up with the mastering, so that's going to be up soon as well. So make sure to check that out if you'd like. Other than that, I will see you next week or the week after, depending on whether or not we survive the polar vortex. And those of you who are in the middle of it, stay warm. Don't go outside. It's not worth it. And read more. Just make sure it's nice, edifying reading. All right, I'll see you all later.